Welcome everyone for this. Oh, now we have them. Yes. Brilliant. Welcome everyone for this book launch event. I realize that we cannot sell the books here, and so I'm showing you the cover of this, the New Turkey and its Discontents. I have to tell you that it's a very timely endeavor to shed light over the emergence and consequence of this so-called New Turkey. Before and especially after the failed coup on 15th of July, Turkish politics are in a state of emergency. And by the crisis in the neighborhood, especially in Syria, but also by increasing authoritarianism and human rights abuses. Every pillar of Turkish politics and social life is changing fast, and the eventual direction of this change is uncertain for many of us. These tumultuous times pose challenging questions for decision makers in the West too. For example, EU Parliament President Martin Schulz, in an interview with the Bild on Monday, said that EU should consider what economic sanctions they can take against Turkey in response to Turkey's post-coup crackdown, including arrests of journalists, many of my friends, writers, and pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, HDP co-leaders, and lawmakers. Schulz also said if Turkey brings back the death penalty, its accession negotiations will end. Not surprisingly, yesterday, President Erdoğan, bashed Schulz, as usual, during a talk where he also suggested one who cannot fathom the philosophy of the shepherd cannot lead. And he continued saying that he too is a shepherd. So we do not need to be very smart to know what that analogy implies regarding the people he leads. In that respect, he also proposed that a referendum is on the cards for Turkish people to decide on whether the country should continue with the EU accession talks. So here is a very current conundrum of a new Turkey. The term New Turkey was first coined in 2010 by the then Prime Minister of the country, Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. As one of the liberal strongmen of the world, he created this Turkey and is now deciding where it's heading right now as the shepherd. With the hostility against the West and the rapprochement with Russia on the table, Turkey seems to be getting off the western-bound train, which it was determined to take as a state policy since the founding of the Republic. All in all, we are at a time where we need more information, more insight, more foresight regarding the situation in this new Turkey, which makes this book very, very timely. Here, one of the co-authors, Emre, who's a very close friend of mine, has finished his BA in the prestigious Middle East Technical University, one of the few pillars of opposition left in Turkey. He then got his master's degree in political science from King's College, London. He's now a DPhil student at Oxford University St. Antony's College, working on a very interesting and challenging subject, the role of Turkish Islamic non-state actors in Turkey's foreign policy making in sub-Saharan Africa for his thesis. Dr. Simon Waldman is a visiting research fellow in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at King's College, London. He obtained his MA and PhD from the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies from the same university. Simon's research focuses on international diplomacy towards the Middle East, state building and leadership in the region, Turkish history and politics from a historical perspective. He is also the head of the Turkish Studies Research Group at King's College. So now it is my pleasure to yield the floor to these very bright academics to enlighten us on this grim situation. Emre, please.
Thank you for your introduction, Ezgi, and chairing event this evening. I would like to also take this opportunity to thank the Right Honourable John Ryan for hosting us here in the Parliament. And also thank you to Research Turkey and its director, Ümit Sönmez, for organizing the event. As I'm thanking individuals, let me also say thank you to my former supervisor, my co-author, and my friend, Simon. Finally, it's also appropriate for us to thank the many coffee shops in London and Turkey, in which we sat for hours and ends, discussing, arguing the issues in the book, writing and editing its text. The book is our attempt at opening up a discussion on what the new Turkey looks like. I believe that fundamentally the new Turkey is a state in which there is no alternative to Erdoğan's rule. This is the case despite the fact that Turkey is generally considered a democratic state. It's a republic with the institutions that, in principle, work within the democratic parameters. There is a parliament whose head is the prime minister, and there is a presidency and a judiciary. Erdoğan's party has been elected into office 4 times, each time with absolute landslide. And throughout, Erdoğan's rhetoric has been that of respecting democratic principles. Indeed, even in 2013, during the Gezi protest, when addressing supporters, Erdoğan said, "I'm not a king, but rather a prime minister, elected with the nation's vote. I'm your servant, not your master." End of quote. AKP's popularity has been in many ways extraordinary and unprecedented. At the last general election in November 2015, AKP won almost 50% of the popular vote. But whilst Erdoğan's popularity is acute compared to previous leaders, Turkey does have a history of the charismatic prime ministers who have dominated the political landscape during their time. An obvious example is, of course, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. But there are others, even if not the same degree, including İsmet İnönü, Adnan Menderes, Bülent Ecevit, Turgut Özal, Alparslan Türkeş, Necmettin Erbakan, and Tansu Çiller. Yes, when I was at school, we had to memorize the names of the past Turkish prime ministers. In Turkish politics, personalities have always been more important than party programs and institutions. However, historically, the dominance of ambitious and capable politicians in Turkey has been tempered by the presence of the military. The army in Turkey is self-appointed guardian of Turkish secular principles and the Kemalist definition of who and what is a Turk. Never a democratic institution, the military was the ultimate check on the power of the political class. So, what changed when the AKP came to power in 2002? AKP's massive mandate after its first election victory empowered Erdoğan to drive through initiatives of pro-EU democratic reforms, weakening the military's power. There was a strong sense in Turkey and internationally that the decline of the army's political power was a promising development that could strengthen Turkey's democracy and political culture. Understandably, this was a period of hope, especially among liberals, Democrats, the younger generation of Turks. Now, however, this hope and optimism has very much disappeared, particularly after the emergency rule following the coup attempt. Erdoğan's leadership and AKP have systematically undermined democratic principles in Turkey. Check and balances have eroded as institutions were infiltrated. The military, the judiciary, the bureaucracy, and the media all have undergone significant changes since the AKP came to power. Let's consider the changes in the judiciary. During the first term of AKP rule in 2002 and 2007, the judiciary served as a check on the power of the government. Staffed by the secularists, the judiciary was often used by the military as a tool to limit the power of the elected government. In the absence of a strong political opposition, the judiciary acted against Erdoğan's government. The 2010 constitutional amendments not only targeted the military, but also saw an overhauled judicial system, allowing the AKP to strengthen its power. New posts were filled mostly by Gülen-affiliated judges and prosecutors. Since the attempt coup in July, the individuals in these posts have been replaced with others. The bureaucracy in Turkey has also changed under Erdoğan leadership. Bureaucrats are a fundamentally important aspect of governance. While elected officials dominate the legislature and put forward policy, it's role of bureaucrats to set it through. In many ways, it is the bureaucrat who is on the front line of the political battles. Traditionally, Turkish bureaucratic elite was dominated by middle and upper-class secularists. In the last decade, the AKP altered this status quo. Overwhelmingly, new appointments have been of individuals from conservative backgrounds. Rather than making the civil service intake more diverse, Erdoğan has replaced one group of bureaucrats dominating the civil service with just another demographic. Indeed, we just have to note that not one of the 81 provinces in Turkey has a governor who is of an Alevi background. As well as the appointments of new bureaucrats, Erdoğan also made structural changes to the civil service, changing departmental remits. And Erdoğan has been on a clear path to deliver constitutional change that would further consolidate his personal power. Whilst conducting interviews for our book, a number of individuals told us that Erdoğan was prime minister. He would often take significant decisions without consulting the rest of the parliamentary party. There was no real mechanism that allowed questioning the authority of the party leader. And as a president, Erdoğan continues to control all domestic, national, and foreign policy decisions. I would like to briefly reflect on the state of the media in the new Turkey. As someone who worked as a journalist, I genuinely and passionately believe that media freedom constitutes a vital pillar in any real democracy. Not only is having an independent and open media an important element of freedom of expression, but it is also act as a fundamental check on power. It is true that the press in Turkey has faced restrictions on red lines ever since the birth of the Turkish Republic. But when AKP came to power, there was a genuine sense of hope and promise about press freedom emerging, particularly when the military power is in decline. But the reality in today's new Turkey is that Turkish media is embattled. Since Erdoğan became president in 2014, more journalists and activists have been tried or arrested on the grounds of insulting him. The government has the media firmly in its grip. It exploits a system that connects wider business interests of media owners to the fortunes of the AKP, which prevents the media from criticizing government. Essentially, commercialization of the media has all but eroded the press freedom in Turkey as well. This deplorable state of the media was highlighted during the Gezi protest, when many media outlets failed to air this historic moment of Turkish history. A rare moment during Erdoğan's political leadership when it was under threat. Until Gezi, and not again since, has there been any individuals, groups, structures, or institutions that have restrained Erdoğan. This, coupled with the intense popularity he enjoys, means that Turkey's future is extremely vulnerable to Erdoğan's personality. He has demonstrated political skills and a shrewdness when exploiting political opportunities presented to him. Even after the coup attempt in July, Erdoğan said it was a gift from God and promised to build a new Turkey. And since the failed military coup, it is unlikely that Erdoğan's leadership will be challenged. If anything, Erdoğan has seemed to enjoy even more support. His authoritarian style has not been detrimental to his popularity among his core support base. Despite challenges within and outside the party, Erdoğan remains the most influential politician to lead Turkey since Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Without a doubt, Erdoğan has been a force in Turkish politics, delivering
We don't agree with you. We don't agree with you.
Okay, let's
delivering
continue.
popular social and economic policies. There has been significant improvements, for instance, in public health and transportation, and a new middle class has emerged in Turkey. Simultaneously, however, the Turkish state and the Turkish people are more fractured and polarized than ever before, and this is because of Erdoğan's leadership. Was perhaps one of the most popular leader Turkey has ever had, Erdoğan is also a divisive political figure. The political landscape Erdoğan has created and the passionate opinion people hold about his leadership is promoting interesting and unpredictable political alliances in Turkey. For instance, in Turkey today, Kurds, Alevis, liberals, seculars, and Gülenis find themselves on the same side, the side that is against Erdoğan. That is the new Turkey. And a new Turkey in which you are either pro-Erdoğan or against him. This is the battle line, and the only line that seems to matter at the moment. Thank you very much, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Emre. I would very much appreciate the questions and comments after the talks. Yes, Simon, please proceed.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for being here this evening and for missing the football. Of course, I wanted to be here. That's the place for me, but I appreciate you coming out to do the same thing. Thank you for your introduction, Ezgi. Very much appreciated, and for you chairing this talk. I'd like to take this opportunity to also thank Research Turkey and its director, Umit, who has come here today despite fighting a flu and a cold. That's very much appreciated. Thank you, and for everything Research Turkey has done. And also, I'd like to take this opportunity, lots of thanks, to thank the Right Honourable Joan Ryan for hosting us here in Parliament. Thank you very much. So, it is a pleasure to be here at the moment, up here with my co-author, Emre Çalışkan. Emre was my MA student in Middle Eastern Studies at King's College London. I was a lecturer there, and Emre came along really quite clueless, straight from Turkey, not knowing the British system and everything, worked so hard, and we became friends. We had many discussions while Emre was a student about Turkish history and politics, and after he graduated, we continued to have this dialogue. We met regularly in those coffee shops that Emre referred to, and we discussed, we debated, we started writing articles together, around 9 or 10, I think in total so far. And that led to a book contract with Hearst, and has led to the actual book itself. There is, of course, a problem of being the former supervisor and teacher of Emre. If you notice, when you open any kind of book, there's the acknowledgements page, and it says that, you know, thank you such and such, thank you so and so, but when it comes to the part at the end, they say, but any errors, omissions, or misjudgments are the fault of the author. Or in the case of Emre, I'm sure he's going to say, if anyone criticizes it, it's my supervisor, it's not my fault. But nevertheless, it's still a pleasure to work with him. The way we worked on the book was, and if you get it and you read it, it was not a case that one chapter I wrote and one chapter Emre wrote. We didn't do it like that. We took each chapter and we did it by theme and deliberately overlapping themes. So I would write something, so would Emre, and it was inevitable that we would write similar things, and that way we had to come together, we had to discuss the different sources that we used, the arguments that we presented, and our different contentions. And then what we would do in, again, these coffee shops or restaurants or whatever, is really kind of thrash it out. Just have a huge argument and debate. And, you know, who won? No, I shouldn't really say, but I mean, it was obviously me. But, you know, we had these debates. And so what came out from this book was, you know, both of our arguments and ideas coming together. And that's one of the benefits of collaboration in academic work. What I want to talk about now is one of those contentions that we came up with. One of the ideas, one of the themes of the book itself. And that was, quite frankly, perhaps controversially, one of the lenses to view Turkey was not to look at Turkey as being perhaps divided between secular and Islamist. That's been done before. We've seen that before. We wanted to do something different. We also didn't think it was necessarily the best way at looking at Turkey. We also didn't think it was necessarily the most productive, the most telling way of looking at Turkey to say this is an emerging democracy or this is a challenged democracy in the Middle East. When we looked at the facts, when we looked at what the trends and the developments in modern Turkey was, we came up with an idea which was different. We said the best way of looking at Turkey was by understanding and by accepting that Turkey is a weak state. Turkey is not a strong state, it is a weak state. Now, at first, we kind of questioned ourselves when we came to that conclusion. And, you know, we even said it to other people and we discussed and debated it. So first of all, let me say what I mean by weak state. What we mean by weak state. A weak state is usually a country which has low levels of civil society activity. A place where there are ethnic divisions, conflict and tension. There is a low rule of law. There is a lack of an accountability, an inefficient military, bad governance, and often authoritarian leaders. Now you can say, in the case of Turkey, hold on a second, you know, in the past 15 years or so, hasn't the economy improved? Hasn't Turkey become more assertive? Hasn't it made certain strides and inroads in certain areas? And we can say, yes, to some extent that's true. Turkey's economy has grown. It's part of the G20 group of nations. It's more active on foreign policy. It's you know, just actually listening to Turkish diplomats or politicians speak, you can hear greater assertiveness in their voice in respect to other nations and other countries. Turkey is also very important, especially in terms of NATO. It plays a very pivotal part. It has a large army, and it's still more powerful than the states that surround it. Nevertheless, we would still contend that Turkey is a weak state. Let me explain why. First of all, when you look at it just on the surface, the paternalistic and authoritarian nature of the political discourse and activities happening right now do not indicate confidence. They do not indicate confidence at all. When you lock away critical journalists, when you delegitimize public intellectuals, rather than praising them, this is an example of an insecure state. The same thing when you look at trying to close the internet, freezing social media. These are the activities of a state which is not comfortable in its own skin. The same thing can be said when you think about checks and balances and rule of law. These are not necessarily just guarantees of democracy. I mean, of course they are, but they're also the indication of a strong state itself as well. Now, I'll return to those factors in a few minutes, but let me just tell you the main thing that made Emre and I, actually, thank you very much, the main thing that Emre and I actually decide or conclude that Turkey is a weak state. Those who are familiar with Turkish politics would have heard of terms such as the deep state, or parallel structures within the state. Okay, for those of you who don't know, let me just briefly say how we understand those things are. Deep state. Deep state means aspects of the military apparatus who, together with individuals or groups within civil society, such as teachers, university rectors, civil servants, journalists, have come together to form a network. And in terms of this network, they have together taken it upon themselves to defend the secular principles of the state and battle against Turkey's enemies, wherever they may be within society. For the most part, it was an instrument of the Kemalist elite, especially during the 1980s and 1990s, fighting against Kurdish separatists and also the threat of political Islam. The real deep state, arguably, was the clandestine network that existed during the 1980s and 1990s against the PKK in the southeast of Turkey. In order to avoid accountability for political assassinations and all kinds of other human rights abuses, the state would often, outsource these activities to different groups which were affiliated with the military and the underground, sometimes even criminal organizations. Later in the 2000s, when the AKP was in power, there was the emergence of these deep state plots against the AKP, that the military, together with different members of civil society, were working to topple the government. On the other side of it, you have this parallel structure, which is often referred to by the AKP and Erdoğan. By parallel structure, we understand that to mean people who are sympathetic or have direct orders from Fethullah Gülen, the exiled Islamic preacher, exiled Islamic preacher in the United States, have infiltrated institutions of the Turkish state and apparatus in order for them to be able to bring forward their own agenda, or the agenda of Fethullah Gülen himself. Well, we looked at this and we said, well, hold on a minute. If this is the case, if this is certainly true, if this is really true, as it has been alleged, that there is a parallel structure, it means the structure of the state itself is weak. Because if institutions can be infiltrated by individuals who have loyalty and allegiance not to the state itself, but to an ideology or an individual, a non-elected individual, then it means that the apparatus, that institution, whether it be the judiciary or the police force, is weak. And by extension, so is the state. The same thing can be said about the deep state. If the deep state really existed, then that meant that rule of law was at its lowest level you can conceive of in Turkey, as was public unaccountability. In other words, indicative of a weak state. Now, going on from this, there are other means of viewing Turkey as a weak state. And let me just go through some of these with you, because I think it's really important to understand what's taking place. Government services, so the extent to which the government can provide basic services to individuals, such as what Emre referred to, like healthcare and things of that, education, things of that nature. The quality of them is an indication of how strong the state is. Well, in that respect, Turkey's performing quite well. It's not bad. I mean, it's not Scandinavia, but it's quite good, right? But Turkey is not just Istanbul. Turkey is not just Ankara. Turkey is not just the cities. There's also the southeast of the country we have to consider as well. And we cannot ignore that. During the 1980s and 1990s, this was an area which was practically a war zone. Gross human rights abuses were taking place, fundamental freedoms almost non-existent, 40,000 people killed, hundreds of thousands of people displaced, and thousands of villages destroyed. What's really, really terrifying today is it seems as if we're going back to how it was in the 1980s and 1990s, especially since the ceasefire with the PKK collapsed about a year and 6 months ago, something along those lines. And since then, we have seen increased conflict in that area. We've seen increased cases of individuals being displaced, around 300,000 people, and villages destroyed. It's almost as if we're going back to the 1980s and 1990s. And under such circumstances, how can the government provide basic services? How could we even say there's a rule of law in the southeast of Turkey? And if the answer is not much of one, then you would agree with me that this is indicative of a weak state. Let's look at civil society. Turkey has a vibrant civil society, but it's embattled. It's constantly embattled. Take, for example, an example that Emre just gave of Gezi Park in 2013. Not only were the protesters brutally suppressed, but their voices were not heard by the government. If anything, there was an attempt to silence it. In the period after, there were crackdowns, there were attempts at internet legislation to ban the internet and things like that, and especially social media sites. So in other words, the civil society actors in Turkey are embattled. And again, this is indicative of a weak state. But it's not just civil society groups, it's also political opponents. Most spectacularly, this has happened in the last week or so with the arrest of leading members of the Kurdish-oriented and liberal HDP, including Demirtas, the leader, the co-chairman of the party. This was, quite frankly, we all know and recognize, deliberate. This was a political act. This is not something that's really about terrorism charges about the HDP. We knew months ago when the AKP passed legislation which was supported by parties that shouldn't have supported it to ban parliamentary immunities in the country. We knew they were going after the HDP, and lo and behold, they did it. They found a way of doing it. And when the courts, when the police force are subservient to the will of politicians, we know that this means that it's a weak state. And we also can recognize that it's highly disappointing and indicative of an insecure state when elected officials can be arrested for trumped-up charges. The HDP won their 10%, and then they deserved a place in Parliament. I think you would agree. Another factor of what constitutes a weak state is when an individual, a personality, can rise above the state itself and the constitution. We're seeing this, as Emre was referring to, on a day-to-day basis with President Erdoğan really violating the spirit of the constitution, if not the letter of the constitution itself. Not only is he chairing cabinet decisions, but he's been campaigning. He's been campaigning on behalf of the AKP. You know, he said, quite frankly, no uncertain terms, give me 400 deputies. Well, you know, he wasn't talking about the HDP. He wasn't talking about the CHP when he said that. But he was talking about the AKP. And this is a president who's supposed to be away from having some kind of affiliation with a political party. In other words, the president can violate the constitution, but that seems to be somehow acceptable. That is indicative of a weak state. And in fact, just to stress the point here, I mean, the current Prime Minister of Turkey was practically appointed by Erdoğan. I mean, we had Ahmet Davutoglu, who was successful in elections, and he had a spat with Erdoğan, and all of a sudden, he's not the head of the AKP anymore, and he's not the Prime Minister of Turkey, despite winning elections. And this is not only a violation of the constitution, but it just shows the weakness of the state. What's also taking place right now, while Turkey is under emergency law, is the discussion and the attempt to change the constitution or to change the political system. This is taking place not in a spirit of openness, of free and fair debate, but while the country is under emergency law. And so in other words, this is almost going to be a shoo-in. Right? I don't like to make predictions, but I think we can quite clearly say that this is the case. And again, this is because the power of an individual has trumped that of state institutions and apparatus, meaning that those institutions were weak in the first place. finally, and I'm going to just kind of rest my case on this final point, another indication of Turkey as a weak state, sadly, is the decline of the military. And when I say sadly, I don't mean the decline of the military as a political force. As Emre rightly pointed out, the fact that the military intervened in politics was against all kinds of democratic principles. But at the moment, it has led to a kind of a crisis, if you like, because I don't think that the military is able and is capable to deal with the challenges that Turkey faces today. During the Ergenekon and Valios cases and the consequences, we saw military personnel, especially in the officer ranks, being charged, put in prison. Finally, in the end, it was obvious to most people who were watching that these were essentially allegations which had no basis. But nevertheless, the moral collapse of the military was clear for those who were on the inside and were able to see. And what's happened now, after the coup attempt in the summer of this year, is that around 40% of the military's officer class are no longer in their positions. In other words, at a time when Turkey is facing significant challenge on the border of Syria, in the borders of Iraq, they're facing a challenge with terrorism from the Islamic State and also offshoots of the PKK and the PKK itself. Turkey does not have the military capability to deal with these challenges. In other words, it's the final indication that Turkey is a weak state. This is the nature of the new Turkey. Rather being a strong state, in recent years it is getting weaker and more divided. And these ruptures in society, these weaknesses within state apparatus and institutions are threatening to pit Turk against Kurd, Sunni against Alevi, secular against religious. This is the nature of the new Turkey. It's a weak Turkey. And, as our book explains, it has many discontents. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon, for this really great talk. And we sense that you share our burden in your heart with your enthusiasm. Thank you. Thank you. So now the floor is open for questions and comments. We have the room until 7, so please...
9.
Oh, 9, I'm sorry. 7 is gone. Until 9, so please feel free to comment. Let's have an open discussion as we have a room to ourselves. Sponsored by Research Turkey, thank you. Yes. Yes, please.
Where do you see Turkey going in the near future? Having presented the state of the country, I think, quite clearly, what is, in your opinion, the next step for Turkey?
Simon, let's go batch by. I mean, let's.
One at a time?
Yeah, one at a time. Until we have batches of questions.
Is it sort of
Okay.
separation,
Okay.
like Iraq or Syria or Libya?
Oh dear.
Is that the next sort of step?
Emre.
It's the time for difficult questions.
Yes, I've been living in Turkey for quite some time, and I'm trying my tricks in fortune telling with the Turkish coffee. But my skills are not there yet. Look, in terms of I don't have a crystal ball, and by training I'm a historian, and I'm a lot more comfortable in what has happened as opposed to predicting what's going to happen in the future. And if I were to do that, I would probably have to think of several scenarios and different things that take place. Let me tell you, I think, what's going to happen in the next couple of months, as opposed to the long term. At the moment, we're seeing essentially now a lame duck president in the United States, which means that in terms of the direct challenge that Turkey faces in terms of the presence of the Islamic State, the Kurds in Syria, you're going to see an increase of the operation which was already started. This is their opportunity to do so, to put actual facts on the ground. And then the next thing that the Turkish government's going to do is say, well, this is the territory we have, no-fly zone, and really push for that with the next administration. So in terms of a foreign policy level, that's the immediate challenge, and that's, I think, the course of action that they will take. It's a shame I'm being recorded when predicting the future. That way I can't deny I didn't. The other thing I think will certainly happen is you're going to see the attempt, probably in a few months, of changing the constitution, perhaps not in its entirety, not necessarily a new constitution, but at least some amendments to give the president more power. And that's going to be essentially the next big debate, problems which is going to take place in Turkey is actually about this presidential issue. It's been lurking in the background for the whole course of the time that we were writing the book. It's happening now, because right now it's under emergency law. Best time to start thinking about how to make the powers that they have now a little bit more concrete in the future with a semblance of some kind of democracy. I don't know if you want to add anything.
It's a million-dollar question in Turkey, actually. So all the political consultants are trying to figure out what's next in Turkey. But I think to look at the 1980s or 1990s would be a good understanding of what Turkey could be in the next 5 or 10 years. So Turkish public has been polarized, which has never been before. But at the same time, although there have been so many clashes and instabilities in political affairs, but the economy still seems stable, and I think this matters a lot in Turkish public. As much as Erdoğan can manage to handle the economy, which is actually Turkish economy is much dependent on in the trade with European partners, like 70-75% of the Turkish economy goes to Europe. And the rest mostly is about Africa, Middle East, and other part of the region. Since the Arab Spring has emerged, Turkish economy has been shaken and faced challenges, but surprisingly, the cash flow managed to actually balance the trade deficit in Turkey. So in terms of economy, Erdoğan's government or AKP government has been stable and much more successful than in previous governments, although there have been so many problems right now. And the question is about the constitutional amendments. There might be some clashbacks, but is it possible to see similar kind of reactions that we have seen in Gezi protests in 2013? For my opinion, after the coup attempt in July, it is quite unlikely to see similar kind of protest, because the movement has gone. Turkey, still with all the difficulties, there has been a better place in terms of its economy, its democracy, its civil service. Since 2013, things are getting worse and worse. More journalists have been arrested. The opposition have been oppressed. Today, some MPs are attacking main opposition party leader, and there is no reaction, which is the weak Turkey and the new Turkey at the same time. But even it is divisive. On the other side of the coin, Erdoğan has the 50% support. He's going to change the constitution. He will have president with executive powers, most probably. But the main question is, what is going to be his legacy after Erdoğan? I think that is the most problematic thing than 5 years ahead in Turkey.
Thank you. Yes, please, you in the back.
Hi there. I have two questions. Thank you, first of all, for a fantastic presentation. I have one question based on what Simon said and one based on what Emre said. For Simon, you've obviously talked a lot about what is a weak state versus a strong state. And to me, it seems like your assumption of the strong state is one which is a function of democracy, a certain kind of social contract. But what if that social contract now is one which is less about democracy and more about protecting Turkey from numerous threats, whether that's security, whether that's potential economic downfall? I'm not saying over the long term that this is a substitute, but does this not mean that we actually have quite a strong social contract for at least the next 5 years perhaps? And for Emre, the question I have is, to what extent do you think that, you said that Erdoğan is centralizing power. Do you think that it's actually possible for him to sustainably have support of more than 50% of the population, say 60%? Right now we're seeing this alliance between the AKP and the MHP, but that also seems to be premised on Erdoğan having some kind of a partner. And do you think that he can eventually do without that partner and maintain the same level of support?
Okay, there was another one here. Yeah.
Thanks. So it's a bit of a long-winded question, so do bear with me. I'm going to try and tie it around a few themes in my head. So I'd like to kind of know what your thinking is about thinking of this in the global developments of the world and the global conjuncture, if I may call it so. What I see happening in Turkey for the last, say, decade or so has a lot of parallels and what to come in a position that we stand in now. Brexit happened, Trump is the American president right this second. So to a certain extent, Turkey has a tradition of very weak civil society and a tradition of a lack of thereof, in my opinion. And then what I see is it pretty much evolves around self-inflated economic conditions, like construction being one, creating some bubbles that is yet to burst, and will probably create a lot more economic misery. But then it also, to an extent, because of that lack of civil society, it is almost pioneering what is to come in the global world order, in which we have Brexit and then Trump as the American president, and we have the relationship between, say, Putin and Medvedev, because that they have that like mutual, okay, now you're the president, and then now let's change, and you're the prime minister, and I'm the president again. So it's, to a certain extent, it is the pioneer, and I mean, I'd like to know a little bit about what you think about whether this is actually something that's the early steps of a new global order, or it is just Turkey because of its certain background and traditions.
Okay, Simon, you go with
Okay.
it too, and then Emre.
So, all right. So I think thank you for your question. It's a tough one, and maybe I'll answer it partially because I don't have time to really think and give you a complete answer. I'm always wary about looking at global trends and linking that with Turkey. I'll tell you why. Because I looked at civil-military relations, and so did Emre. We looked at it together. And of course, if you look at civil-military relations, it's not just about Turkey, there's also other places as well, Latin America, where that's a big issue as well. Well, in most countries where there is some kind of military involvement in politics, and in the period after, there usually is some greater degree of democratization when the military declines in its power. In the case of Turkey, that didn't happen. It's the opposite has taken place, which makes us wonder, okay, why? We can't necessarily bracket Turkey in a particular box. It has similarities, but it also has differences as well. Yes, I think Turkey does fall into that kind of category, however, having said that, as an illiberal democracy, as Farid Zakaria has famously put it. And you can see similarities with other countries and states in that respect, including Russia and including some South American countries as well. There is this kind of idea, if you like, I forgot who put it forward, the dictator's learning curve.
Yeah.
And the idea that, do you remember the author? I can't remember the author of it. It was a very interesting read. And the idea is that, in the modern age, dictators are able to adapt with the same different movements that democracy activists actually put forward themselves, and almost countering democracy activists with their own medicine. And I'm reading it, and I'm thinking to myself, God, this is just like Turkey. But what is Turkey being bracketed with? Well, what country am I comparing them with while reading this book? And it's China, and it's Russia, and it's Venezuela, etc., etc. And that's not good company to be with. So what's certainly the case, and this is why we wanted to have a change of outlook when we looked at Turkey, is that the idea, or the kind of the brand of Turkey, of this kind of this country, Middle Eastern country, if you like, which is Muslim but democratic, and if Turkey can do it, so can do it, other states in the region. That's something that we shouldn't really use. We have to be kind of careful with it. So sometimes you can bracket Turkey in the kind of the moving global order, and sometimes it has its exceptions. The closer you analyze Turkey as a specialist, the more you find exceptions naturally, and I think that's the case. I had a question about, it was a really, really good question about the nature of the social contract in which the way I describe a weak state. And I have a kind of a leaning towards democracy, or the principles of democracy, in defining how strong or weak a state is. I must say that if you look at states in the region and different indexes that actually rank these kind of things, you find democracies tend to be on the kind of the stronger scale. And your kind of objection to me, or I guess your kind of counter-criticism that, well, okay, that could be the case, but what about the other factors that could be leading to something else, is valid. But I would say that even if you look at other factors, they still indicate a weak state. And especially in the case of institutions. Institutions in Turkey, leaving aside the democracy aspect, are increasingly based on demographics and the cultural identity of individuals in terms of appointments into civil servants, promotions, and things of that nature. And by doing so, it creates fissures, divisions within the state itself. And that threatens the strength of the state. And meanwhile, you have ethnic divisions which are really there and obvious. Emre mentioned the example about how many Alevis do you see as governors across Turkey? Well, the answer is, none, right? And this is very problematic when you consider the size of the Alevi community. And these creates these tensions and weakens the state itself. So it's not just democracy, which is an aspect there, even though I do think that it's a very important one. But thank you for the question.
So I will actually try to respond to two questions, James and your question together. So also how Erdoğan is sustainable is very much linked to the political and regional and also global conjunctions and developments. The sustainability of Erdoğan, he has been very successful in changing his alliances. Let us look at his first alliances. He had the support of the Misyat people when he came to power. He had, I think, you should read in the book and you will find the exact numbers, but I think 22 MPs when AKP came to power in 2002 were the members of the Misyat. So it was an emerging economy, the discourse, like the Anatolian targets were behind the AKP. So this was the alliances in 2002. And they were the AKP was also trying to get rid of the military, out of the politics, and the alliance was with Gülen supporters. But by 2013, this has been changed, and AKP started to make new alliances. First of all, Erdoğan also started to make new alliances, which is very interesting, actually. So old friends, Abdullah Gül, Bülent Arınç, or other MPs are not anymore in politics or any political calculation. And even his advisors have been changed. He has been very pragmatist. He really managed to read the time, and the time of the split, actually, of his own era. So, for instance, when you look at the Erdoğan's advisor, İlhan İlnur, who was the former advisor to Barzani, and now he's Erdoğan's top advisor in foreign affairs. It was only İbrahim Kalın who is still with Erdoğan. Davutoğlu is out of politics. Even he was under attack of Erdoğan, which might be even arrested after the coup attempt. Same thing for Arınç. But let's look at the other advisors. Cemil Ertem, who used to work for Bir Gün newspaper, which was a left-wing newspaper in Turkey. Then he worked for Taraf newspaper, and now he's a nationalist liberal. It's even hard to describe his political...
You're very polite today.
his political stance, but this is Erdoğan's top advisor in economy, in addition to Yiğit Bulut, who was, again, pro-nationalist gentleman, who was...
Very polite.
who was harshly criticizing Erdoğan. And look at the two deputy prime ministers, Soylu and Kurtulmuş. They were both the head of the previous center-right party leaders. And the old guys changed, and new guys came, and Erdogan still in politics and still in power. That is the success of Erdogan, to keep changing alliances. So what we see, and is it sustainable? He has been sustained. He has managed to sustain this trajectory since he came to power. And now his new alliances are with mostly nationalist people and nationalist party, and as well as National Outlook Welfare Party, former members of the Welfare Party. For example, when I went to my fieldwork in Africa to work about Turkish foreign policy in Sub-Saharan Africa, I came across very much many nationalist or former National Outlook Party members. So I see the change in the post or the echelons of Turkish foreign ministry, which was very interesting actually from my own personal experience. And why Erdogan is now alliancing himself with the nationalists, this is also another question, but basically he doesn't trust his own party. He believes that the AKP had a very much involved with relation with the pro-Gülenist people, and he's afraid of even from his own party. That's his actually weakness, because he doesn't trust anybody, and he has no aid around him that he can actually sincerely he should consult. This is not stable so far, but Erdogan managed to change the alliances and sustain Turkey for the last 15 years. And this also embedded with the change of the region. So Erdogan, when we look at the region and the global politics, we see illiberalism and we see rationalism instead of liberalism. So 2 years or 3 years we have been talking about the EU deal. Yeah, the Syrian conflict, the biggest challenge for Turkish foreign policy, was useful for Erdogan to stay in power, for sure. And now he has been illiberal since the Gezi protest. If you look at the numbers of the people who have been arrested or other closure of the newspapers, but the world has been changing now. We have Trump, we have Brexit, we have other leaders even in Greece, Hungary, Bulgaria, and now the Trump is talking about to bring Assad back to the political stage. So this also fits where Erdogan stands now. So it seems like it is still in his time. He's not vested anymore in his region or in international power, I would say.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I have a question to Emre. On the rise of the nationalist rhetoric, how do you evaluate AKP's changing governance understanding? How do you evaluate the more centralized understanding of governance, which was unusual in the late 2000s when AKP, unlike other Turkish other Turkish parties, showed an appetite to decentralize government, gave more power to local government agencies. And now we see a totally different trend. How do you evaluate this within this rising nationalist rhetoric of AKP?
Is there any other questions, comments? Oh, yes, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Actually, I have two questions. One is regarding the actual social phenomenon right now in Turkey.
Can you please raise your voice?
I actually have a microphone.
Oh, that's good.
Better?
Yes, much better. Oh dear.
Actually, one of my questions is regarding social phenomenon right now in Turkey, which is the arrested people, also the journalists, but also the public sector workers in Turkey, that they are being arrested and banned from working in public sectors right now. And as far as we can see, they're not being judged or investigated in compliance with the fundamental rights protected under the Constitution. So, as far as I can see from the public opinion, that there is also a silent population in Turkey towards this all arresting. So, do you think, for example, Mr. Çalışkan wrote a model that there are two blocks with anti-Erdoğan and supporters of Erdoğan. Once you take that kind of those people who are not being able to find jobs in the following term in Turkey, wouldn't that pose another dimension of blocks in such calculations? Don't you think, wouldn't that cause a chaos that I actually, as a Turkish law student, get scared from actually? And my second question is about the last decision given by the Constitutional Supreme Court in Turkey, which actually explained that there will be no more control for the compliance of the statutory decrees because the Article 148 gives us this legitimacy. How do you evaluate in all of these conditions that with this Constitutional Supreme Court decision, how do you evaluate all those efforts to make a presidential system in Turkey? What would be the outcome of that kind of referendum for you as an academic perspective? Thank you.
Simon, would you want to take one of those?
Yeah, it's okay. I'll
Oh,
pass.
no.
No. Of course I will. Of course I will. Let me see. Okay, so I'll try and address some of those. Okay, so those who are arrested and banned, and can this potentially, I think what you're trying to say, can they potentially constitute a new bloc against Erdoğan and the AKP? Yes, perhaps they possibly could. I'm still not totally convinced of how sizable that would be as a bloc separate within itself, but I don't think that goes against necessarily what Emre is saying, like a pro or anti-Erdoğan. It just enforces it. That's not the priority of the AKP. Now, I just gave you a kind of an argument, if you like, that Turkey is a weak state. And funnily enough, I think, or have an inclination, that the ruling party and Erdoğan think so too. They looked at the situation with deep state plots, parallel structures, and they thought that they needed to strengthen the state. And by doing so, they attempted many purges. This is not just a purge, after the attempted coup. This is something that has been going on for several years already. And their attempt was to strengthen the state. But the mistake that they've made is in their effort to strengthen the state and its apparatus, they have been excluding many people at the same time. The priority for the AKP is to strengthen the state in order to continue a democracy, but with loaded dice, for those who kind of gamble, right? Where the house always wins. So in other words, if you want to think about what kind of presidential system there will be, it's obviously a presidential system which would guarantee the status quo and a little bit more to ensure that the AKP will be in power for years to come. Okay? And yes, there are those who suffer from this, right? Injustices. Those who have had their passports confiscated, perhaps undeservedly, or lost their livelihood, and they're not allowed to reapply for their old positions. Yes, this will create further discontents. But so what would be the position of the ruling government? So what?
Exactly.
Emre, if you want to answer.
Yes.
Yeah, I will respond to the question about the decentralization. Actually, the time of decentralization in Turkish politics has gone, which was a period that Turkey was negotiating with EU for full membership. I think it's not anymore on the agenda. This was one of the requirements of the EU Copenhagen criteria to give decentralized governments. But I was actually I'm also trying to follow up James' question about sustainability, because when I talk about Müsiat, you see also decentralization of the economy, meaning there were different groups, there were different camps in the economy. We were talking about Antep, Denizli, Bursa, Kayseri, Konya, the rise of the Anatolian powers, Anatolian tigers in economy. This was different model of decentralization, giving, increasing the change of the structures of the economy. But now when we look at today's economic structure of Turkey, we see 4 or 5 companies who are behind all big mega projects. And surprisingly, they are not the conservative companies. When you look at all the big companies right now constructing the third bridge, the third airport, Osman Gazi Bridge, they are the companies mostly based in Ankara, Chechen Holding, like Çalık, and other two, which I don't recall the names, they were the secular companies. So they are the new alliances of Erdoğan, because now we see that in Turkish economy, the main investor of the economy is the public expenditure, is the state itself. So not only about the governance of Turkey, but also the politics of Turkey has been centralized. I think this is very much linked to each other as well. So clearly, at the moment, Erdoğan doesn't want to share its power with other groups. And in terms of
Supreme Court.
in terms of the
Constitutional Court.
in terms of the Constitutional Court, I mean, we have discussed before we came to here whether there will be change or Constitutional Court. It seems that Erdoğan has a public support following the coup. So basically, people still believe that Fethullah Gülen and his followers are behind the coup and they should be punished. And this is also surprising. I had a line pro or anti-Erdoğan. In my fieldwork, I will try to give examples from my fieldwork, which is also, you can put so many examples in our book as well. But in my fieldwork, I work on 5 different Islamic groups, which are always competing with each other. It's very interesting. In Turkey, we have different Islamic groups. It seems they have all same agenda, same goals, same ambitions. They all support Erdoğan. But when it comes to real politics, they never cooperate. They always compete with each other. When you look at the Menzil group, for example, they have their own business network. When you look at Aziz Mahmut Hüdayi, like Muradiye Vakfı, they have their own business network, which is interesting and different. And again, the other dimension of why Turkish civil society is weak and why Turkey is a weak state, because there is no kind of any consensus or common backgrounds, common similarities in Turkish public. We have one nation religious order, and they have their own networks, own religious groups, own business groups, and the fear or love of Erdoğan makes these groups united. Not only the hate of Erdoğan keeps Alevis, Kurds, and Kemalists united, but those groups are still happy to work with Erdoğan than other alternatives in Turkey. Even if they don't support publicly, they don't criticize Erdoğan publicly, and they do support Erdoğan, they are not, in my personal experiences, in my fieldwork, they were not very much happy with Erdoğan's policy decisions. But still, he's the leader of country, and he's the strongest man, and nobody is actually there to challenge him at the same time. So that is the line pro or anti. So in terms of this constitutional change, in my opinion, he has a support. He's over 50% support to back his presidential system.
Thank you, Emre. Yes, please.
Okay. Why no one can judge Erdoğan, who is a traitor and, and even in Lahey, that they say there were some court cases against him and so on. Russia gave some trucks and so on, gave some documents, but no one can judge him. And I mean, a lot of judges, a lot of prosecutors who were just sent away and they lost their jobs or whatever. No one can do anything. And everyone is just, sorry to say, talking. But there is no any movement about it. And I really, as a Turk, don't understand this. I mean, why is it nobody can do anything about it?
Is there? Hold on. Is there any other question? Okay. To the centralization, yes, please.
Do you think this this reapproachment to the national sentiment is because AKP realized that Turkey is a weak state and realized that they won't be able to maintain power without capsulating all right-wing sentiments.
Okay, Simon, go ahead with The Hague.
Okay.
I'm keeping Emre safe here.
Okay, all right. Okay, so reapproaching to national sentiment. Look, it's always very easy. What's that? Did I do the
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay, so why can nobody judge Erdoğan? I'll do that first, and then we'll come to... Okay, so first of all, let us not forget that there are at least 50% of Turks who voted for Erdoğan and like Erdoğan. This is not someone who was, took charge of Turkey by a coup or something like that. He and his party have been elected 4 times and himself directly elected as president. So there is much support for Erdoğan in that respect. You cannot discount it. So when Erdoğan was talking about Gezi protests, he says, well, you bring 100,000, I'll bring 1 million. He wasn't joking. And he was being serious because he can mobilize 1 million. And I'll tell you another thing as well, that, something that we did a little bit of research, we didn't have too much time after the coup, is that, there are networks of civil society groups which are supportive of Erdoğan as well. The AKP has their own social media followers as well, which counter that of his opponents. And another factor in this as well is, there's loaded dice here as well. Okay, so when you look at the next election, no doubt the state media will be overwhelmed by the speeches of the Prime Minister and the President when there's going to be referendum changes, and if it gets brought to constitutional changes, when it's brought to a referendum, you'll no doubt see those in favour and the position in favour. It's going to be overwhelmingly supported by the media. So you've got that, which is difficult. And I'm going to say something else as well, and another answer as to why. There is another social network which exists in Turkey, which is very rarely talked about because it's not really understood necessarily as a social network or a social movement, and that is the institution of the mosque. Within the mosque, there is essentially a rallying place for those who support Erdoğan, and we saw it in the period after the coup, that the mosque was used as a rallying centre to oppose the coup itself. Now, those who are watching it from the outside, like me, says, okay, so this is a bad development, but so is the coup itself. So it's a kind of an interesting place to be. But the point is that the mosque was a place of politics. The mosque was a place of mobilization. So if Erdoğan says, you have 100,000 people, I can get 1 million, no doubt the institutions of the state, through the media, through municipalities providing the flags and the mobilization with the paying for the buses and the transportation, will be utilized, as will the networks of Turkey's mosques as well. So that's how I interpret that one. I don't know if you want to add anything.
To follow up Simon, it is only people can challenge Erdoğan. And right now, the majority of the people in Turkey supports Erdoğan. It seems, and the elections in Turkey are fair comparing to other countries, which is the reality. And in Turkish politics, as we have seen, it's the part of the majoritarian politics in Turkey. The Turkish people like characters and the leaders. And since the beginning of the AKP came to power, the fight between the AKP supporters and anti-AKP supporters was always on Erdoğan's personality. I mean, in my opinion, maybe Simon would not agree with me. If any political movement wants to challenge Erdoğan, I would suggest to not to attack his personality and go for decentralization. Erdoğan's party, Welfare Party, came to power in early 1990s against the media, against the state, against the society. They first took the control of the major municipalities. So if you want to challenge Erdoğan, go to decentralization, go for local elections, provide services, provide opportunities. If you are a social democrat party, show that you are a social democrat party and you can make change in Turkey, but not by attacking Erdoğan's personality. I mean, my argument was the Turkey is all about Erdoğan now. And the Turkish vulnerability is based on Erdoğan's future. And in my opinion, Turkey is more important than any individual or any political leader. So, for the second question, I would say decentralization and the centralization of the power. Yeah, again, this is very much linked to weak state argument, because in state of Turkey, we see different groups. Alevis, Kurd, not much at the moment, but we see different groups, different religious groups. I would track 6-7 different religious groups. After the coup, I mean, Ezgi would know much better than me, but Erdoğan was talking about the Birlik Vakfı. You may not have come across these names, but this is the Birlik Vakfı, like the followers of the Akıncılar, whose head was Karaman, the former parliament speaker. So his people now replacing the followers of the Gülen people. So Erdoğan seems to need alliances. So this is the weak state. And if you want to challenge the Erdoğan, propose meritocracy, bring quality, bring new ideas. And yet, in any other opposition parties, you have Erdoğan in the government, but you have Kılıçdaroğlu and Bahçeli in other parties. No one can challenge the authority of party leadership. The majoritarian politics is not limited to Erdoğan. It is the reality of Turkey. And this is the new Turkey. Weak state, weak society, strong leaders, but the most strong one is Erdoğan.
Yeah, I agree with that. Something else I would add in terms of like the national sentiment and the kind of the rhetoric after like the post-coup kind of period. When you look at the AKP, it wasn't as if they're all of a sudden becoming more national in their tone or something like that, or trying to appeal to national sentiments. No, they're trying to own it. They're trying to take control and be the definition of being nationalist in its outlook. So, in other words, nationalism is not necessarily something which is owned by the secularists. The secularists are the Turkish nationalists, the Kemalists. It's not really like that. The AKP themselves considered themselves nationalists, had a different definition of what is and who is a Turk and what the Turkish nation should be. And they saw this as an opportunity of taking the reins of that and essentially owning what it is to be a nationalist Turk. Nationalism is, it's an ideology which is quite weak, actually. It changes within times. It's flexible, even though it's a kind of an ideology that people fight and die for, risk their lives to. It's actually very fluid in terms of its tenets and can be flexible over time. And, in that kind of post-coup period, you saw how that was able to be done.
I would like to contest Emre at this moment. The thing is, for example, like Simon and like you said, the situation in Turkey cannot be isolated from Hungary's Viktor Orban or, say, Russia's Putin or the Brexiteer rhetoric. When we look at those rhetorics, discourses, we see similarities and also differences. One of the similarities is those people, those populist strongmen, when they came to power, they, like Syriza, be utterly pragmatic and just to stay in power, make different alliances like Erdoğan does. So the key to these, the common denominator in these strongman, the illiberal populist tide, is if you get the rule, don't let it go, because it would the stakes are very high. And when Emre says that it should be challenged, there's something particular about Turkey. This is a new kind of, because of its cultural and social history, and because of if its coordinates on the map, there's something new about this authoritarianism, which is the governance is so particularistic, which is like there's no social government. The help is made through a party structure. So it is really hard to challenge. I mean, you cannot challenge that and through decentralization, because it's all it's above and beyond the state structure now. So it is hard to. I mean, you can't really say that. If you are a social democratic party like CHP, or if you claim to be one, why don't challenge the guy? I mean, the guy has like 243 hours of state channel propaganda, while Selahattin Demirtas had 11 and Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu had 23. So what kind of a challenge are we talking about, really? This is absolutely and utterly not true. Okay.
Can I respond to the question?
Yes, I'm the chair.
Yeah, that was a challenge against you, Emre, not me. She agrees with everything I said.
I agree, but when we look at the early years of the Welfare Party, especially in the post-1980s, there's a huge urban demography change in Turkey, which is a part of the Kurdish question. So many Kurdish origin people moved from the rural areas to the city centers, and they were vulnerable, and the state institutions are neglecting to address the problems of the newcomers. And yet the AKP, or at that stage the Welfare Party, managed to deliver services by municipalities, by local authorities. In the case of municipalities, when you look at the opposition municipalities, you don't see any initiatives to be inclusive for vulnerable and disadvantaged groups. Even by their actions or arguments, you don't see any differences than Erdoğan policies. In the first election of the Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, when he came to party leadership, he said, "We will give you better minimum wage. We will support you. We will support social contract, green card, something." But actually, as Simon mentioned, AKP has been already delivering these channels, these helps through party channel. So actually, the opposition party only say we can do better. But why would you choose the better one if you have already won?
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
So then maybe the change of the discourse in the local authorities, change of the politics should be addressed. But we are academics, we are not the political advisors of Turkish opposition parties.
That's true. And one other thing that's important is the kind of the similarities to other strongmen, in not just the region but also in the world. I mean, this is certainly true, and there is that attitude of once you get power, don't let it go. Yeah, okay, that's true. But I mean, what I'm interested in is that what is that indicative of? Well, you can see a different character, tone, actions by different strongmen depending on the foundations of their state and their country. So, for example, you have Trump, who has been elected in the United States. But patriotic loyalty in the United States is not to the individual who's been elected, it's to the Constitution. And in other words, the Trump has to work within the Constitution itself. So, if you...
We'll see.
We'll see. But I mean, so for example, do you think... I don't see Fethullah Gulen being extradited to Turkey within a week. There is due process that takes place. There is certain limitations. And if he were to fight against the checks and balances system in the United States, there will be an outpouring to defend the Constitution, because that is very fundamental to American identity. And when you look in other kind of places like Turkey, like Russia, etc., you do not see the same institutional foundations of the state, allowing what foundations are there to be manipulated, to be eroded, to be basically torn apart by these strong men who are willing to do so.
Last round for questions and comments, and then we're going to wrap up, if there are any. Yes, please, sir. Back, at the back. Yes, you. Can you
speak
please
up?
speak up?
Or the mic.
Or the mic.
But he's sorry.
In terms of the mixed state and also the society information for what we should expect after Erdoğan, so what kind of struggle to imaginations or what kind of Turkey that we're going to see after Erdoğan. So basically, it's going to be ended in some periods. Is that so?
When? Can you tell me? When? So that I can go back to my house?
Human nature. So basically, and afterward, no one's just living in infinity. So afterward, it's going to be
Look, this is an interesting question. It's something that's difficult to predict.
Hold on. There was another
okay,
hand right behind you. Oh, there wasn't?
Here, gentlemen.
Oh, okay.
Oh, here's another one. Yes.
In your research and book, how much consideration did you give to the fact that if Erdoğan lost power, he will be in jail for the rest of his life for committing enormous for violating the Constitution and the laws, and for being the most corrupt prime minister that Turkish politics or probably the world has ever seen.
So that's...
He cannot afford to lose power, and he will do anything to stay in power and to protect his neck. To put it bluntly, I think that's what will govern Turkish politics, in my opinion, and I'm sure you must have considered it, although it's unpleasant for academics to speak about these things. But I think that's what will govern Erdoğan's politics. And I think his time his days are numbered. He's having opposition from his own party, and that's why he's changing alliances, from day to day. He is trying to save his neck because not just himself, he's in corruption with his family. The whole world has seen it. Everyone has listened to the tapes. So let's talk about real politics now.
Okay, so...
Simon, go with the...
I'm going to combine the two together,
Yeah.
I think, because I mean, it's like imagining Turkey after Erdoğan, and if there is an after Erdoğan, would he then face prosecution, be in jail, etc., etc.? Well, you know what? There are some leaders who die peacefully in bed. Right? Despite the brutal Spanish Civil War, how did Franco die? Yeah, okay, and you can think of other examples as well. And I think that's going to be the case. I don't see at the moment a smoking gun to indicate that in the next 5 or so years that there's going to be a reason as to why Erdoğan would lose an election, or even if there's going to be some kind of rebellion against him within his own party. I don't see it. I mean, so, I can't answer the post-Erdoğan question because I don't see a post-Erdoğan in the medium term. I'm afraid I just don't see that at all, and I can't. And sometimes we had discussions about under what context could such a development take place. And there are very few, and they seem quite unrealistic the more that we think and discuss them. Quite frankly, those who voted for Erdoğan and the AKP have a lot to lose. They have too much to lose.
Yeah, because of the system.
Exactly, because of the system. And therefore, there is a strong, solid 40 to 50% of the vote which will continue to vote for the AKP and for Erdoğan himself. And if there has to be, and this is what we were talking about before, the only way to oppose Tayyip Erdoğan is through political means, probably both on the local level and also on the higher political party level as well. But again, I see the opposition quite divided, and the only thing that unites them is this anger towards Erdoğan. So.
But Simon, I think because you you described Turkey as a weak state. Yeah. We have to remember that it has a tradition of 600 years of statism. Mm-hmm. So if this could be weakened in like a 30 or probably 15 decade and a half time, after the strong man leaves office, what kind of a state will we have? Would it be a failed one?
Okay, first, I disagree with your kind of like 600 years history of a state. 500 years of that was empire, which is a completely different set of circumstances. In an empire, yes, there is a sultan in this case, who is supposed to be the centralized head of state, and there were different challenges to that, etc., etc. After that, so from 1923 onwards, Turkey becomes a republic. Mm-hmm. The problems of the initial post-republican period and the problems of now are different. Because if we were to look at the difficulties, if we had wrote this book in, say, 1999, it would all be about the military. Mm-hmm. And I would be arguing right here, right now, that Turkey is a weak state because it's prone to military interference. Mm-hmm. Right? But the problem right from the beginning is after 1923, after 1960, after 1980 coups, the constitutional practices and the transition period were not strong, stable enough then. And then the only hope for a strong state is with a new constitution and system. But the problem with that is we know that's not going to be the case. That's just going to exacerbate tensions which are already there. So it's not very positive or pleasant to say, but I think it's time that we kind of recognize the problem in terms of before we kind of move on, and that's just the way in which to understand Turkey is it's a state with weak foundations.
So Emre, with your last comments, let's have your last comments and then wrap it up, okay?
There was a hope for Turkish politics when Turkey was negotiating with the EU. This came after the financial crisis of 2001. Turkey brought a prophet on the earth, Kemal Dervish, for some analysis from the United States, from the World Bank, and he implemented a plan. And quite frankly, this was a positive hope for Turkey. Even though you could criticize him for many wrong things or his neoliberal policies, but the first time in the history, Turkey started to build up independent organizations, like central bank, capital networks, energy centers, the board of the energy centers, the board of the capital stocks, the board of central bank. They were all selected by the parliament with the consultation, but they had 6-year, 8-year ruling time, which actually would be not affected by the decisions of the politics. That's why Erdoğan had a big problem with the Turkish central bank when he was in power. Even in his best days, he was telling off central bank. This was the legacy of the Kemal Dervish. There was hope to set up independent institutions. Yes. But this hope is already gone. These independent organizations, structures, like setting up an establishment within the states, is no longer case in Turkey. Yes, Erdoğan would be the most corrupted leader of Turkey. He would be the most divisive politician of the Turkey. But on the other side of the coin, he is the most unifier factor for many groups, mostly conservative groups or nationalist groups. And Turkey has been a corrupted state. We all know that. But the level of corruption has been increased, as well as Turkish economy has increased. When Erdoğan came to power in 2002, the GDP per capita was around $3,500, but today is around $9,500. Turkish GDP has tripled in 15 years. And this creates also discontents. The problem and the legacy of Erdoğan, he managed to erode the institutions and check and the balances. And this makes Erdoğan is the only alternative to rule the country right now. Yes. Because if there is no strong power in this weak state, the state institutions or even the society, the polarized society would go into civil war or would go into kind of turbulent times, more than I believe today. So Erdoğan created a system which makes Turkey dependent on his leadership. The legacy of Erdoğan, I think, is more... I have been living abroad for 8 years. Maybe I don't feel the difficulties of living in Turkey. But I think we all, Turkish observers, analysts, or Turkish people, all get on with the idea of living with Erdoğan in different extent. But the problem is the legacy of Erdoğan. Who is the next of? Who is be his replacement? Would you be happy to see your president Melik Gökçek, for example? Would you be happy to see, I don't know, Berat Albayrak as your next president? And nobody is going to be as strong as him. So Turkey will go through again different process. And the coup was an opportunity to build up a new Turkey with strong institutions. If you blame the parallel state, they penetrated state institutions and took the advantage of it, then you have again new state, and he had a support, like a majority of the all the parties in the parliament supported, even HDP supported him. He had a chance to build up new institutions, and again this is this chance is lost. So after the Erdoğan, the hope and the legacy would be to start up again institutions, check and balances, the more multicultural, more plural, more democratic, more vibrant, which would make Turkey great again. Thanks.
Do you have last comments?
I'll just say something briefly. I mean, we've talked about Erdoğan and the AKP a lot, but you know, just something I just want to say is like, and something that we learned while researching the book, it's like, what motivates Erdoğan and the AKP? What do they stand for? What are they trying to achieve? And you know, in the course of the different interviews that we had with people who are sympathetic towards the AKP or AKP officials themselves, we noticed that they would always start with a narrative, a long narrative of victimhood. We didn't ask the question, what happened? They just voluntarily gave us this. And very interesting, it is a question of justice. It's in the name of the party, the Justice and Development Party. And from the perspective of the AKP and Erdoğan, they see the history of the Turkish state from 1923 onwards as of that where those who are sympathetic towards their worldview, those who have the same cultural identity as them, have been victimized and marginalized, and they're trying to right past wrongs. And those who vote for Erdoğan and the AKP, they're terrified because they have this narrative that whoever replaces them would once again victimize them and exclude them from from mainstream Turkey. And in any successful political party that seeks to challenge the AKP must go to the basis of this sense of injustice and challenge it. And in order for Turkey to heal, there has to be an attempt to say, no, there's not going to be factionalized politics. You are a Turkish citizen, and as a Turkish citizen, based on merit, you have the access to become part of a state institution, be a bureaucrat, if that's what you want to be, or you can have promotions, etc., etc. And until that's crystal clear, you're going to continue to have this divided political system.
Thank you, Emre Çalışkan. Thank you, Simon Waldman, for this great event.